Orion sat alone in the dimly lit cockpit of the warship, the hum of the engines the only sound that kept him tethered to reality. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly into the void, an ever-present reminder of the war that had consumed everything he had once known. His mind wandered, as it often did, back to Leora, the woman he had promised to protect, to love, and never betray. Her last message, a plea filled with desperation and love, echoed in his thoughts. But that was before. Before the war had changed everything. The war had a way of twisting even the most steadfast hearts. It had been months since he had last seen her, heard her voice, felt the warmth of her hand in his. Months since he had been able to hold on to the life they had built together. And now, in the depths of space, far from the planet they had once called home, that life seemed like a distant dream. Leora had been the center of his world, and now she was just a memory. He thought back to the first time he had met Astrid. She had been a quiet force, always present, but never demanding. She had joined the ranks as a strategist, but it wasn't long before her sharp mind and fearless nature had caught his attention. There was something magnetic about her, something that drew him in, even when he had tried to keep his distance. Astrid had been his rock in the storm. Every mission, every battle, every moment of uncertainty, she had been there, always. Where others saw a cold and ruthless soldier, Orion saw a woman who had seen too much, a woman who had been forced to bury her own demons in order to survive. And in those moments, when the line between life and death blurred, it was Astrid who had made him feel something again. It had started small. A shared look here, a quiet conversation there. Slowly, imperceptibly, it had become more. But it wasn't the kind of more that was obvious to others. It wasn't the kind of more that could be labeled, could be defined. It was just there. A tension that neither of them could ignore, even as they pretended it didn't exist. The first time he had touched her, truly touched her, had been after a battle. They had just survived a deadly ambush, the kind that left a man questioning whether they were alive by luck or fate. In the aftermath, as he had leaned against the hull of the warship, trying to regain his bearings, Astrid had stepped close. Her presence was steadying, a quiet strength that kept him grounded. "I thought I lost you," she had whispered, her voice a strange mix of relief and fear. Orion had looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Her eyes, dark, intense, filled with things unsaid, locked onto his. There was a shift then, something unspoken that passed between them. A connection. He hadn't been sure what to do with it, and part of him had wanted to push it away. But the weight of the war, of the isolation, had made it impossible to ignore. Before he knew it, she had taken a step forward, and their lips had met in a kiss that neither of them had planned, but both had needed. It wasn't a kiss of passion or love. It was the kind of kiss born of desperation, of needing to feel something human in a galaxy that had become nothing but destruction. He hadn't resisted. He hadn't wanted to. But the moment they pulled apart, reality hit him like a cold wave.
Leora.
He had Leora. He had made promises. This was a betrayal, even if it hadn't gone beyond that one kiss. Astrid had pulled away first, her breath heavy, but her face unreadable. There had been no words between them after that. No apology. No explanation. Just silence. It wasn't until later, when the adrenaline from the battle had worn off and the weight of what had happened settled over him, that the guilt began to eat away at him. He had never been a man to dwell on things, war had taught him that much, but this was different. He wasn't sure what it was about Astrid, about that kiss, that had shaken him so deeply. It wasn't just the physical act. It was the emotional connection that had followed it. The way her presence had started to fill the space that Leora had once occupied so completely. Orion's mind drifted back to the messages Leora had sent. They had become more frequent as time passed, her words growing more desperate with each one. She missed him. She needed him. And each message brought with it a gnawing reminder of what he had left behind. Yet here he was in the vastness of space, thinking about someone else. Someone who wasn't his wife. The war had done this to him, he told himself. It had forced him into situations where every choice seemed impossible. where survival meant compromising parts of himself he hadn't even known existed. And in the darkest moments, when the weight of it all felt unbearable, Astrid had been there. She had become the constant, the thing that anchored him. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He had let her in. He had let himself need her, and that was where the danger lay. Because no matter how much he tried to deny it, no matter how much he reminded himself of Leora and the life they had shared, part of him knew the truth. He had crossed a line. And even if nothing else happened between him and Astrid, even if the kiss was the extent of it, that line would remain, drawn permanently in the sand. He stared out at the stars again, feeling the weight of the decisions he had made and those he hadn't yet. The war would end eventually, but the consequences of his actions would remain long after the dust had settled. The question now was whether he could live with them, or if he had already lost everything that had ever mattered. Orion's thoughts were clouded, but there was no time for reflection. The war raged on, and his focus had to be on the mission. Yet, even amidst the chaos, Astrid's presence was impossible to ignore. Every time their eyes met, there was an understanding between them, something unspoken but palpable. He could feel it, a constant pull, as though the war itself had woven them together in ways that neither of them could untangle. Astrid was different from Leora, in so many ways. Where Leora was gentle and nurturing, Astrid was fierce and relentless. But both had captured pieces of his heart, and the realization was something he had buried deep, unwilling to face. He had once believed he was a man who could love one woman completely. But here he was, entangled in a web he had woven himself, caught between duty and desire, loyalty and temptation. The nights had grown more difficult, more confusing. There were times when Orion could almost forget the war, the galaxy crumbling around them, the faces of the fallen soldiers and civilians. In the quiet moments, when the battlefield was far behind them, it was easy to believe that it was just him and Astrid. They would share a drink, talk about the battles they'd survived, laugh at the absurdity of their situation. But then, in the silence that followed, the pull would grow again. One night, after a brutal raid on an enemy stronghold, Orion found himself alone in the crew quarters with Astrid. They were both covered in blood and dust, too tired to move, too drained to speak. But the weight of the silence between them felt heavier than anything. The lingering tension from their earlier encounter still hung in the air, unspoken and unresolved. "Orion," Astrid said softly, her voice low and husky from exhaustion. "Do you ever wonder how much longer we can keep pretending?" He didn't answer immediately. The words were too heavy, too raw. He had felt it too, the way the line between friendship and something else had blurred over time. But he had kept his distance, pushing the thoughts away, telling himself that the war was all that mattered. He had Leora. He had promised her. But here, with Astrid, it was hard to remember any of that. "I don't know what you mean," he replied, his voice almost a whisper, not meeting her eyes. Astrid let out a short laugh, a sound that was bitter and tired. "You're not fooling anyone, Orion. Not me. Not yourself." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. There was no escape from the intensity in her eyes. He knew she was right. He had been lying to himself, pretending that the connection between them was nothing more than a temporary distraction, something born of the chaos of war. But the truth was it was something more, something deeper, and it scared him. "I don't want this," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "Not like this. Not when everything's falling apart." Her expression softened, but there was a hardness to it, as if she had already come to terms with something he wasn't ready to face. "Maybe this is the only thing that isn't falling apart. Maybe this is the only thing that's real anymore." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew she was right. There was something about their bond, something raw and real, that no war or betrayal could destroy. But at the same time, the weight of what they were doing, of what he was allowing to happen, was unbearable. He couldn't betray Leora. He couldn't betray everything he had ever stood for. Yet, here he was, standing on the edge, torn between what he knew was right and what his heart had begun to crave. Astrid didn't move, didn't try to force him to answer. She simply stood there, waiting, her gaze never leaving his. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Orion knew that something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be undone. "I need to know, Orion," Astrid said quietly, breaking the silence. "Do you feel it too?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment he knew. He had known all along. He had just been too afraid to admit it. The connection, the pull between them, it was undeniable. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain. And it terrified him. "I don't know what to feel," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what's real anymore." She took another step closer, and this time, he didn't pull away. Her hand brushed against his, and for a moment, the entire galaxy seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered was the warmth of her touch, the way she made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in months. "This," she whispered, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "This is real." And for the first time, Orion didn't pull away. He didn't push her out of his mind. He didn't remind himself of Leora, of his promises. He simply stood there, caught between the past and the present, between duty and desire. In that moment, it was all that mattered. Nothing else existed except the two of them. And then she kissed him, and everything else, the war, the promises, the guilt, disappeared. It was just the two of them, existing in a world that no longer made sense, a world where the only truth was the warmth of each other's touch. But even as the kiss deepened, even as he let himself succumb to the feeling, a small part of him, the part that still remembered Leora, still remembered who he was, screamed for him to stop. But it was too late. The moment had passed, and there was no going back. This was no longer just about survival. This was about something far more dangerous, something that could tear apart everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed in. The weight of the kiss lingered long after the moment had passed. Orion could still feel the ghost of Astrid's touch, the warmth of her lips, as though they had branded him. He had told himself that it was a fleeting lapse, something born of war and desperation. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The guilt had already started to seep in, and it was gnawing at him, reminding him of the promises he had made, the life he had left behind. Leora's voice haunted him in the quiet hours. He could almost hear her words as if she were standing right beside him. She had written to him so many times, each message filled with love and longing, but also with growing concern. At first, he had told himself that her fears were misplaced, that everything would be fine. But now, in the aftermath of that kiss, her concerns felt like a distant prophecy, one that had been waiting to unfold. Orion had tried to bury it all, the guilt, the shame, the fear, but it was impossible. Every time he thought of Leora, he felt like he was betraying her all over again. But the more he tried to push her away, the more he found himself drawn to Astrid. She was his constant, his companion in the war, and slowly, imperceptibly, she had become something more. Every battle they fought together only strengthened the connection between them. But what did it mean? Was it love? Was it simply the bond forged by the horrors of war? Orion didn't know anymore. What he did know was that he couldn't go back. And he couldn't stay here, torn between two women. The messages from Leora had become more desperate as time passed. There was a rawness in her words that made it impossible to ignore. She needed him. She missed him. She had no idea what was happening on his end, but she had a feeling that something was wrong. Orion could feel her hurt through the words, and it cut him deeper than any wound from the battlefield. The message that had come in this morning had been the breaking point. Leora's words were simple but suffocating. "I don't know who you are anymore, Orion. You're a stranger to me. I can't do this alone. I can't keep waiting for someone who isn't coming back." That was it. That was the moment it all fell apart. Orion had always been able to convince himself that he was fighting for something, fighting for Leora, for the future they had planned. But now, with the war seemingly endless and his heart torn between two worlds, he couldn't remember what that future looked like. He couldn't remember what it meant to come home. And then there was Astrid, standing beside him, leading him through the war, keeping him grounded in a way he never thought possible. She had become the only constant in the chaos, the only person who truly understood him now. But even as he felt the pull towards her, he couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at him, the constant reminder of his broken promises. It wasn't just the kiss that haunted him, it was everything that had come after. The stolen glances, the late-night talks, the quiet moments that had turned into something more. It had all been building up to this. Astrid had confessed her feelings to him more than once, each time more vulnerable, more open. She wasn't ashamed of what had happened between them, but Orion was. He was ashamed of how easily he had given in, how quickly he had forgotten his commitment to Leora. And he couldn't reconcile that with the man he had once been. The war itself had become a reflection of his internal conflict. On the battlefield, everything was clear. Fight, survive, win. But when the fighting stopped, when the noise faded, there was nothing but silence. And in that silence, the truth began to surface. Orion wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a man at war. He was a man who had failed the one person he had vowed never to betray, and who had let another woman slip into his life in ways he couldn't explain. The next mission arrived swiftly, and with it, another assault on the Zenith Dominion's stronghold. It was brutal, the kind of battle that left no room for second-guessing, no time for reflection. But even in the midst of the violence, Orion couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The adrenaline was there, the rush of battle, the clarity of survival. But when it was over, when the dust settled, he was left alone with his thoughts again. Alone with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. Astrid was injured in the fight, a shallow but painful wound to her side. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was enough to pull her out of the action for a while. As they retreated to the ship, Orion found himself once again beside her, trying to keep his emotions in check. But it was impossible. She had become too important to him, and now, every moment with her felt like a reminder of what he had lost, and what he had gained. Astrid saw it in his eyes before he could even speak. She knew. She always knew. Her gaze softened, but there was no judgment in it, no anger. Just a quiet understanding. "You're not alone in this, Orion," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever you're going through, you don't have to go through it alone." Orion wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that they could find a way through this, that there was a future beyond the war. But he couldn't escape the fact that he had already betrayed everything he had once held dear. He had already lost his way. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Astrid didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply reached for his hand, offering him the only thing she could give, her presence, her understanding. And for a moment, he let himself believe that maybe this, whatever this was enough. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Because no matter how much he tried to convince himself that he was a soldier, nothing could erase the truth that he was also a man torn between two lives, two worlds. And in the end, he wasn't sure which one he could live with losing. The mission was over, but the aftermath had only just begun. The silence in the warship was deafening as Orion sat alone in his quarters, staring at the flickering messages from Leora on his screen. Each one felt like a weight, pressing down on him, suffocating him. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve the betrayal, the uncertainty, the doubt. She deserved someone who could come back to her whole, someone who hadn't been irrevocably changed by the war. But Orion wasn't that man anymore. He had tried to convince himself that his feelings for Astrid were temporary, a side effect of the chaos and danger of their situation. That it was something born of desperation, of needing to hold on to anything human in a universe falling apart. But he couldn't deny it anymore. The connection was real. The chemistry between them, the way their bodies had reacted to each other, was undeniable. And the worst part was that it had happened so naturally, so inevitably. Every moment spent with Astrid, every shared glance, every quiet word, had brought them closer. And now there was no going back. Orion closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair, trying to drown out the noise in his head. The war had been all-consuming, and he had thrown himself into it fully, unable to see anything beyond the next mission, the next battle. But now, with the fighting over, The silence was unbearable. The reality of what he had done, what he was continuing to do, was crushing him. He had betrayed Leora. He had betrayed her trust, her love, everything she had given him. And in return, he had hurt her in ways that couldn't be undone. The thought of returning to her, of facing her after everything that had happened, filled him with dread. He couldn't even begin to imagine how he would explain himself, how he would explain the months of distance, the silence, the growing feelings for another woman. There was no excuse, no justification. He had done this. He had crossed the line. And then there was Astrid. She had always been there, always by his side. They had been through so much together, and each battle had only deepened their bond. She was his rock, the one person who understood him without words, who saw through the facade he had built. And now, after everything, after the kiss, after the moments they had shared, he couldn't look at her without feeling a mix of desire and guilt. The guilt was suffocating. It clung to him like a shadow, reminding him of everything he had promised Leora, everything he had vowed to be. And yet, the pull towards Astrid remained. There was no denying it. She had become a part of him, and no matter how hard he tried to push her away, the connection between them remained unshakable. He had tried to avoid her, tried to keep his distance, but the more he did, the more it hurt. It hurt because he knew he couldn't have both. He couldn't keep lying to himself, pretending that he could return to Leora, pretending that everything would be the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. The war had changed him in ways he couldn't even fully comprehend, and he had let it. He had let it fracture everything he had ever cared about. Astrid's voice echoed in his mind. "You don't have to go through this alone." She had said that. And maybe it was true. Maybe, in some way, they could make it through together. But the truth was, he didn't know if he could live with the consequences. He didn't know if he could face the aftermath of the choices he had made. He had once believed that love was a simple thing, that it was a promise, a commitment, something you fought for and protected. But now, love felt like a weapon, something that could destroy everything it touched. He had promised Leora that he would always come back to her. He had promised her a future, a life together. But what did that mean now? How could he go back to her knowing what had happened? How could he face her knowing that part of him belonged to someone else? He stood up from the chair, pacing back and forth, the walls of the warship closing in around him. There was no easy answer, no way out of this tangled web of his own making. He couldn't go back to the way things were. But he couldn't stay in this limbo, either. He couldn't continue to live with the weight of his own actions, the weight of the love he had betrayed and the love he had found in someone else. The mission had ended, but the real battle was just beginning. The battle wasn't against an enemy army. It wasn't about surviving the next raid or outsmarting their adversaries. It was about surviving the consequences of his own choices. It was about coming to terms with the man he had become. Orion knew that no matter what path he chose, there would be no easy resolution. If he went back to Leora, he would be living a lie, hiding the truth from her, from himself. If he chose Astrid, he would be turning his back on everything he had once believed in, everything he had promised to be. There was no right answer. There was no way to fix the damage he had done. As the warship drifted through the cold, empty space, Orion felt the weight of the universe pressing down on him. He had been a soldier, a protector, a man who had lived by his promises. But now, with everything in ruins, with everything fractured and broken, he didn't know who he was anymore. He didn't know what he was fighting for. The silence was unbearable, but it was the silence that had brought him to this point. It was the silence that had allowed the guilt to grow, the silence that had separated him from everything he had once known. And now, as he stood alone in the dark, there was no one left to talk to. No one left to help him make sense of what had happened. All that was left was the weight of his own choices, and the knowledge that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again.